Good morning and welcome to City Watch, New York City's premier watchdog program for social, economic, political, and cultural issues. My name is Edwina Francis Martin, and I am co-hosting today with Jeff. I always mispronounce your last name.
Simmons.
I want to say Simons.
Remember Richard Simmons or Gene Simmons. That's how people do it.
Okay, that's good. That's what I'll think of when I think of you. I don't know if that's a good thing, actually. So today, City Watch joins with people around the globe recognizing World AIDS Day. To help us delve into what the city and state are doing to address AIDS, we're going to be joined by New York City Council member Danny Dromm, chair of the City Council's LGBTQI caucus, Johanne, is it Morne or Morne? Morne, director of the New York State Health Department's AIDS Institute, and Eugene Eppes, a linkage specialist at Alliance for Positive Change. So Jeff, I don't know about you, but this has been a really thoughtful week for me as I remembered friends that I lost to AIDS, as I attended different events. And actually tonight I'm hoping to make an event on Staten Island at the Pride Center, a candlelight vigil for World AIDS Day. What did you think of this morning as you were coming in?
Well, the first thing that hit me was, I'm one of those people who immediately checks my my Twitter feed first thing in the morning, and the news of former President George H.W. Bush's passing, because what does go through my mind was his tenure as vice president under Ronald Reagan, and a lot of the criticism. He had passed away last night, by the way, not early this morning, but a lot of the criticism over his response to the surging AIDS epidemic, which began when he was serving as the VP under Reagan. And of course, we've heard often about Reagan being mute for years on acknowledging the epidemic. And if you look even on a Twitter feed and you plug in his name and AIDS, you're seeing that there is a good number of tweets criticizing him. But what also crossed my mind was his wife passing away earlier this year. I believe it was in April.
Yeah.
And one of the stories that resonated that was out there, a friend of mine from the Washington Post, Jonathan Capehart, had reported on this, was an image from very early, only months into his tenure, where Barbara Bush was cradling a baby who had AIDS. And I looked it up this morning, and what Jonathan had wrote was true, that Barbara Bush had broken that shameful silence with a hug and her voice, and she saved lives that day by bringing attention to the ignored. Still, this did not mute a lot of the criticism. He continued to be booed and criticized about a tepid response to the surging epidemic at that time. That, honestly, is what shaped my mindset this morning, the news of his passing and this all becoming aware on World AIDS Day.
I was still relatively young at that time, relatively. But I actually remember that picture of her with the baby. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because I thought about that picture when I heard about him passing, before I thought about all the things he did that perhaps made me unhappy. She was a beacon. And, he leaves his legacy as it is. He was vice president at sort of the rise of the AIDS epidemic. And where are we now with fighting this disease? I pulled up a few statistics from the Centers for Disease Control, as well as from GMHC. And to help frame our conversation today, I wanted to share with you just a few snippets. In 2016, 39,782 people received an HIV diagnosis in the U.S., with a decline of 5% of HIV diagnoses between 2011 and 2015. 1 in 5 new HIV infections today are amongst young people aged 13 to 24, and African Americans account for a higher proportion of new diagnoses, those living with HIV, and those who have ever received an AIDS diagnosis, compared in relation to other races and ethnicities, accounting for a whopping 44% of HIV diagnoses in 2016, although African Americans are just over 12% of the U.S. population. That's really incredible. Drilling down for a few more NYC-specific data, according to GMHC, 42% of HIV-positive New Yorkers are over 50. That's interesting, right?
Yeah.
77% of new HIV diagnoses and AIDS-related deaths are amongst African Americans and Latinos. And once again, that is just a whopping statistic. In the backdrop against, that information, we received in New York City and in New York State this week a lot of positive news on the front in the war against AIDS. With just over 2,000 New Yorkers getting newly diagnosed last year, New York City experienced a 5.4% decrease in diagnoses from 2016. Even more encouraging, the number of new diagnoses in New York City has decreased by 64% since HIV case reporting began. The estimated number of new infections in New York City also continues to decline, with a 35% decrease amongst men who have sex with men and a 36% decrease overall since 2013. And on the statewide level, we also have some pretty positive data that shows new diagnoses of HIV in New York hit record lows for a third consecutive year. In 2017, it was down 20% from 2014. So where, are the big issues on the front in the fight right now? It's awareness and availability. Awareness of your status, education regarding testing and treatment, particularly in the low-income communities of color that are still being really hard hit by this disease, and availability of treatment. But thanks to innovative initiatives and funding on both the city and state levels, many believe that New York is on the brink of ending the AIDS epidemic by 2020.
Which would be fantastic.
It would be incredible. It would be incredible.
So here to discuss that is our first guest, as you mentioned, Edwina. Our first guest today is New York City Council member Daniel Dromm. He chairs the New York City Council's LGBTQI caucus. And I could give you a long description of his bio. I have known him for years. I even started, my first encounter with Danny was when I was a young, hopefully I could say that, a young reporter, and interviewing him when he was within the New York City school system as a teacher who made a number of headlines. And I'm not going to tell his story. I'll let him do that. But Councilman Dromm, welcome to our show today.
Welcome.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. It was a great time in those days, fighting back against that oppression from the school board.
Yeah, and in fact, I have so many questions for you, but I thought of that this morning, and, going back to that period, that's where I just wanted to start off. Going back to that period, how important of a role did you play in raising awareness about sex education in our schools and being an openly LGBT member of the Board of Education? Why was that important for you to speak out? Because that's what brought me to you.
Sure. Well, actually, those were the times when we were promoting a curriculum called the Children of the Rainbow curriculum, which was initially designed because of the murders of African-American men in Howard Beach and Bensonhurst. It was like around the time when Al Sharpton first came forward and was fighting, hate crimes back then. And 3 pages of that Children of the Rainbow curriculum dealt with same-sex families. And my school board had a regulation that did not allow teachers to discuss 4 forbidden topics: homosexuality, birth control, abortion, and masturbation. And so I came out as an openly gay teacher in response to the Children of the Rainbow curriculum. And as they say, the rest is history from there. But can you imagine having AIDS education in a public school system where you couldn't talk about those 4 topics? It was worthless in that sense. So all of the work that I did in that sense was related to both LGBT rights, but also fighting for HIV/AIDS education. And now that I'm in the city council, I have an opportunity to do a lot more, which I wish I could have done way back when.
And you mentioned things that you imagine being able to talk about them back then. I also think about the climate back then, and in the wake of the news of the former president passing away, and also he had served as vice president under Reagan, who had received harsh criticism. What went through your mind today when you reflected on his tenure as president and vice president and their response to the emerging and then surging AIDS crisis?
Sure, I think there's everything is relative to a certain extent. When you think about who the president is today, Bush was light compared to Trump. But we must remember, it's unfortunate I hear all these media folk today on the news waxing eloquent about the president, but he actually opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He never mentioned HIV/AIDS while he was vice president during the Reagan administration. He only visited an AIDS clinic, I think, around 1988 or so. And actually, he was nominated for his second term at the Republican National Convention the same year that Pat Buchanan delivered his Culture War speech, that famous Culture War speech primarily lodged against the LGBT community. So it's a mixed bag with him. I mean, eventually he did come around, and I think it was at Barbara Bush's, his wife's suggestion, or pushing, that he actually began to talk a little bit more about HIV and AIDS. But it was a battle.
Councilmember Dromm, hi, this is Edwina. Thank you so
Hi,
much
Edwina.
for joining us today. When you mentioned those 4 forbidden topics, my mind went to Nancy Reagan and her abstinence campaigns and their focus on that for dealing with all of the ills of the world. And just, sort of how incredible looking back that was, how really devastating and dangerous it was. And HIV and AIDS is still very much a part of our lives. And in particular, I don't know if you heard some of the statistics I was saying earlier, but it still is witnessed in unacceptably high rates amongst people of color. What should the city, in your opinion, be doing more of to address AIDS in New York City, especially in the hard-hit, low-income communities of color, amongst women of color as well, because it just stubbornly remains so high amongst these demographics?
Yeah, we still see those high rates of infection, particularly amongst women of color. I think one of the things that needs to continue to happen and probably even work more on is working with communities of faith as well to get the message out to people to deal with the stigma. As a matter of fact, I just met with the minister of one of the churches here in Jackson Heights the other day, and we had a long discussion about what else could be done in terms of getting the word out about HIV and AIDS infection. I think also the promotion of PrEP is something that's really important, and trying to get the word out to those folks who still have not heard about it or do not have coverage for it. We held a hearing, I guess it was on maybe Thursday morning, with the administration, and the health savings plan was discussed, and part of the discussion there was about the fact that 97% of the unionized workforce has some type of coverage for PrEP, but 4 or 5 unions still do not have that type of coverage for PrEP. And one of them was the police department, believe it or not. Police officers, sergeants in particular, do not have that coverage. So if we're talking about ending the epidemic, that type of prevention ultimately is what's going to end the epidemic. And if the city isn't providing that to people, we're falling down. But the council has invested in numerous initiatives to help end the epidemic. And in fact, last year we put $7 million into the Ending the Epidemic initiative, which was actually up from 6.3 the year before. The administration has put in about $23 million annually. $15 million, which actually comes from the city, and about $8 million that comes from state funding. So, but it's education, it's ending the stigma, it's putting money where our mouths are, and continuing to get the word out and working with community-based organizations that ultimately will help to end the epidemic.
So you mentioned unions that are resistant to providing coverage, and that just sort of made me think about, the city's efforts. There have been quite a few, and as you know, there's the initiative to end by 2020 on the city and the state side as well. Do you believe that these efforts are bearing fruit? And then sort of on a different tack, and just once again on sort of what the city is and isn't doing, based on, your experience as a teacher and what you're hearing from teachers now, do you think that there's enough being done with youth education and prevention and treatment?
No. Just yesterday, a report came out from the Department of Education saying that only, I think the number was about 37% of students in middle school through high school are actually receiving health education and sexual health education. That is a number that I always suspected was the case, and we passed legislation. It was actually Councilmember Lori Cumbo's legislation that passed in 2016 requiring the Department of Education to begin reporting on the number of students who are actually receiving that type of education. So 37% means 2/3 of New York City public school students still are not getting sexual health education. That's a disgrace, and if we want to end it, and I think the numbers that you spoke about earlier in the program, Edwina, were about the youth and where we see the increases happening with youth, we've got to address this issue at an early age, and middle school is really where we need to work on it. So that's unacceptable, but at least now we have some statistics on it. It was anecdotal before that, and hopefully the DOE will begin to take some action to correct that.
So, Councilmember Dromm, on a day like today, World AIDS Day, what does World AIDS Day represent to you? And on a day like today, who do you pay tribute to or remember?
Well, it's a sad day, but a hopeful day. It's a day that we can't let go by without recognition, which is why I'm so glad that you are doing this program devoted to World AIDS Day. I think about the friends that I've lost. I lost dozens and dozens of friends. I lost a friend on Thursday afternoon. He had contracted AIDS in the 80s, thought he was going to die then. Then the drugs came out, AZT came out, and he was able to reverse course, but never really able to fully gain good health. My brother-in-law is HIV positive and is in a similar situation. So it constantly reminds me that much more work remains to be done and that we need to raise the level of awareness if we're really going to end the epidemic. So sad but hopeful, and knowing more work needs to be done.
So we've only got about another 2 minutes left, and on another issue that we did want to ask you about in your district. I mean, I'm a resident of your district, so I'm aware of this. We have a number of residents who are persons of transgender experience. Can you tell me what you're hearing from them about, or given the president's announcements about scaling back on the rights? Are people feeling less safe right now?
Oh, they're definitely feeling less safe, and when you combine that with the immigration status of many of the transgender folk who live in this community, they're definitely very scared about what's going to happen. So, the pressure that they have in their lives is just incredible. About 2 years ago, I met with the New York City Health Department, and they said that there were pockets of increased infection in the city, and one of them was around Roosevelt Avenue between 69th Street up to about Junction Boulevard. And that was one of the areas where they had seen increases in HIV infection. So, being transgender, being, undocumented, worrying about AIDS infection, imagine the pressure that's put on people, but particularly with transgender women. And even police harassment along Roosevelt Avenue, I get a lot of reports of that as well. So difficult, but we also are fighting. We're working with organizations like Make the Road, Trans Latina Network, the Longer LGBT Network, to push back against that type of oppression.
And I know from your outreach in the community how for years you have met with groups that represent or are comprised of persons of transgender experience, so I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Dromm, chair of the Finance Committee, chair of the Council's LGBTQI caucus. How can folks find out more about the caucus and the work that it does, and also more about you and the work that you're doing?
Sure. Well, there's a number of ways. They can call my office at 212-788-7066. They can go to the council website. They can email me at ddromm, DDROMM, at council, COUNCIL.nyc.gov. I answer my own emails and appreciate input and discussion. And they can also go to my political website, which is Daniel Dromm, DANIEL, Dromm, DROMM.com. And they can see the work that I've done.
Councilmember Dromm, thank you so much for joining us today on City Watch. Have a great day.
Thank you, Edwina. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
So, our next guest to talk about the fight against AIDS in New York State is Johanne Morne, director of the New York State AIDS Institute. Johanne has been with the AIDS Institute for more than a decade as its director for the last 3 years. Her professional and clinical experience is in public health and behavioral health, particularly within communities of color. Johanne, welcome to City Watch's World AIDS Day program.
Thank you so much, and good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
So what's the message that you'd like to convey about the significance of this day? Sure.
First, let me start by saying thank you. I think that it is just incredible that you're hosting this morning's show on World AIDS Day. For me and for so many of the people that are in my life, we see World AIDS Day as 4 specific things, really. It's the opportunity to honor the people that we've lost. It's an opportunity to provide increased education and awareness, as you're allowing us to do through this opportunity this morning. It's taking time to acknowledge and celebrate the gains that we have made, because there are many, many accomplishments that we can point to over the last multiple decades. And it's also a day where we recommit to the work that we know we have to continue to move forward with in order for us to truly work towards our goal of ending the epidemic.
So you've served as director, as we mentioned, for the last several years. The Institute was founded very early on amid the epidemic in 1983. Tell us a little about what the Institute does and about its resources.
Sure. So we can look back to 1983 and be grateful for the vision and the forward thinking of then Governor Mario Cuomo, who developed or created the AIDS Institute. And so over the years, we have grown. In the early years, certainly we focused on providing care, access to treatment as it was available then in limited form to persons who were diagnosed with HIV or living with AIDS. And over time, we've grown to recognize that our community actually can benefit from so many of the experiences and initiatives that we have. So the AIDS Institute portfolio includes, yes, HIV, but also STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, hepatitis C, LGBT health, and drug user health. And we work among all the synergies for us to be able to move forward and provide access to prevention, care, and treatment across our portfolio.
Now, the state has set goals towards ending the epidemic. How far have we come to date? What's sort of the status on reaching those goals?
Sure. So in 2014, Governor Andrew Cuomo had publicly announced that New York State was in a position where we felt we were ready to declare that we were able to end the epidemic in our state by the end of 2020. And so, as you said, and as was discussed earlier with Councilman Dromm, certainly there are goals that have been set, and our intention when we talk about the end of 2020 is to significantly reduce HIV diagnosis. And so, as you discussed and you talked about some of the actual metrics or surveillance information, we definitely are seeing that since that time of announcement, built on the many, many years of work that had taken place over the last 35 years, we are heading in the right direction. And we continue to see decreases as it relates to diagnosis, increases as it relates to people accessing and linking to care, and most especially for persons who are diagnosed with HIV, the ability to achieve viral suppression, which we know contributes to one's quality of health.
Where have you seen the greatest strides amongst sort of those?
So I think the greatest stride, there are multiple strides. I think that, if you look at from a bigger picture, there are the opportunities that we have learned through science, such as undetectable equals untransmittable, or as others refer to it, U equals U, in which we know through science and recent studies that, an individual who has a sustained, suppressed viral load cannot sexually transmit the virus. I think there are strides in the fact that in 2012, Truvada, as PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, a one-time-a-day pill that is intended to prevent the transmission of HIV, became available. I think the strides are that, as indicated in the public release yesterday from the governor's office, that, from the beginning, when the declaration of ending the epidemic was made, we said that we could not say at the end of 2020 that we had achieved the end of the epidemic if, in fact, any remaining diagnosis or transmissions were within one particular community. And so we've worked really hard in partnership with our community partners to make sure, in the data that was shared in yesterday's release, that we are seeing the reductions across all communities. But, Edwina, as you talked about, I think it's also relevant for us to acknowledge that we still do have disparities. And in those disparities, we really have to prioritize how we're getting information to communities, particularly among women of color, among young people. And as we look at other epidemics and other public health areas that we have to focus on, such as the opioid epidemic, for persons who use drugs, we have to make sure we're prioritizing the education, the access, and the creation of environments and care environments that are respectful and free of stigma.
And, talking about the environments, and that leads me to think about access to a life-saving medication and to resources that can help people. The governor you referenced before, that he had made an announcement, and I believe one of the announcements had been about the state health department getting ready to publish new regulations that would expand access to its HIV uninsured care programs. Can you talk a little about that?
Sure. So the HIV uninsured care programs are better known as ADAP, the AIDS Drug Assistance Program. So we're really fortunate in New York State. We have one of the best ADAP programs across the nation. And what we've done is really look at, within our regulations, what are continued opportunities so we can increase access for individuals who are under or uninsured. And so what was detailed in yesterday's press release are the ways in which we're looking to address some of the barriers, like, for example, when we talk about an individual's assets, there had been a cap of $25,000, looking at opportunities to lift that cap so that individuals who, have higher incomes, or individuals who may have other resources, aren't necessarily left out of the opportunities of ADAP. So I think what we're doing is looking at every possible way that we can remove the stated barriers that have been told to us, so we can ensure that all persons have access to care as well as treatment. And in that press release, I also think it's significant, and it can be found on the governor's website, to understand what the HIV uninsured care programs offer, because there are multiple initiatives and there are multiple ways in which people can receive assistance.
I was going to say,
go ahead, Jeff.
Just to remind
we have so many questions.
I was going to say, well, actually, to remind our listeners, because we're at the halfway point here, you're listening to me, Jeff Simmons, as well as my co-host, Edwina Francis Martin, on WBAI New York 99.5 FM's City Watch. We're also streaming live at WBAI.org, and we are on the line right now with Johanne Morne. She is the director of the New York State AIDS Institute.
So, Joanne, I read the release yesterday, and I think another thing that was in it was related to the health insurance coverage is that there's no longer an asset limit. Is that correct?
Right. So, with the new regulations as they were proposed and would move forward, what it would do is it would increase eligible income to 500% of the federal poverty level, whereas before I believe it was at 435. And it would also eliminate the cap on the resources or assets that I had previously mentioned.
All right, fabulous.
And as far as next steps, so that your listeners understand as far as how regulations work, those regulations will be published and they'll be public in mid-December. And that allows the opportunity for people to provide comments once they're able to review the actual details. And hopefully, as we move forward, the adoption is anticipated for early 2019.
So when does the comment period end?
I believe it is a 60-day comment period. So if it's published in mid-December, it would be 60 days from that date of being published.
All right, wonderful. I remember, the time when people, when they were diagnosed, in order to get care, had to shed everything they owned, basically, or went through everything they had in order to be eligible to receive services. And so I think that both of these changes that you just referenced and talked about earlier are so critically important.
Well, thank you for that. And I think that certainly, again, the opportunity to work in constant alignment with our community, being able to get input from individuals who are impacted by these programs, and recognizing with the significant advancements that we've made as it relates to medication or access to care, people's lives today are very different and look very different in many circumstances than the experiences that so many had in the 80s or the 90s. And so it's important that our systems stay aligned with those changes and recognizing that many people are working, many people have assets. And I believe, as Councilman Dromm mentioned, many people are moving towards older ages. And so we have to take into consideration what those changes mean and make sure that our systems are meaningful for the people we intend to serve.
So, Joanne, on a day like today, what goes through your mind? Who do you think about, and or is this a time to celebrate because of the advances? Is it a time to mourn? How should people mark this day?
It's all of the above, and I think each individual person marks the day in a different way. I was fortunate yesterday to participate in partnership with New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and the Ending the Epidemic Coalition membership in the World AIDS Day event, and then last evening participated in a faith event where faith leaders were coming together to talk about how we can continue to find opportunities within faith communities to welcome members of the LGBT community, and in particular individuals of trans experience, within different congregations. And so I think that the power of World AIDS Day is that it is a moment to stop and reflect. And for some, the reflection is on the past and those who have been lost. But in that, we also have to take the opportunity to recognize what has been accomplished. That for many of the people whose lives have been lost, their lives were dedicated to making sure that we continue to move forward and that people had access to treatment, to care, and to be able to live a life that didn't include stigma and discrimination, but was based on love. And so World AIDS Day is an opportunity to reflect on all of the above, but as I said in the beginning, to recommit and make sure that we continue to move out with persistence as it relates to the compassionate work that we do, the programs that we develop, and our ultimate goal of ending this epidemic.
So as much as you had attended the event yesterday during the day, I believe that might have been the one at Baruch College?
Yes.
And the service or ceremony last night. Your work continues next week up in Albany. Can you talk about this with our listeners about what's on tap for next week?
Absolutely. So next week, December 4th and 5th, will be the New York State World AIDS Day event. On the 4th, during the day from 9 to 4 o'clock, the Empire State Plaza Convention Center will host a series of the AIDS Memorial Quilt as well as educational sessions for students, high school and middle school students come. We tend to have anywhere between 800 to 1,000 students who come from different districts during the day. The reason that it's so important for the students to come is because it's direct communication with people who have lived experience. And so we work with a speakers bureau who are willing and are courageous enough to share their own life experience and take questions from the students. The AIDS Memorial quilts, certainly we know, tell a story of their own, and for students who did not have the experience of the early years are able to help us explain to them sort of the history of where we are as it relates to HIV and AIDS. And also we bring in many of our community members who can share continued resources that students can use beyond the actual event. At 4 o'clock, we will move into the New York State Ending the Epidemic Summit, which provides updated information from all of our partners and providers across the state, as well as our partners across the nation, who will talk about the initiatives over the last year that have proven to be effective and plans for 2019 as we move forward in our work.
So, Johanne, how can our listeners find out more about the summit, especially if they're able to go to Albany for one of these days? Can they
Absolutely.
just walk in, or do they need to register ahead of time?
So registration is appreciated, but we will never turn someone away. Any opportunity to share information is an opportunity that we would take. There are actually two specific websites that I was hoping I could share with your listeners. One is that in general, if you're interested in learning and continuing to learn about where we are heading in New York State related to ending the epidemic, then you can always find updated information and data at ETE-Dashboard-NY, that's one word, ETE-Dashboard-NY.org. And then information on the summit as well as the World AIDS Day event on the 4th can be found at www.health.ny.gov and simply search Ending the Epidemic.
So, Johanne, you've been at the Institute for 10 years, 3 years thus far as its director. What do you hope your legacy will be?
My legacy. Let me say that being in the position of director certainly provided big shoes to fill. We have been so fortunate at the AIDS Institute to have incredible leadership and support. I hope that, if anything, I will continue in the just steadfast commitment to ensuring that, individuals living with HIV at risk of transmission and the general public will always have access, whether it's to prevention, whether it's to care, and will have access within environments that truly, truly look to provide care to individuals without any type of stigma or discrimination. I hope my legacy will be a continued development of a team, an incredible team in the Department of Health and at the AIDS Institute that will always show compassion and always take every opportunity to be innovative as we look to develop new models and build on existing models so that, again, persons have what they need at the time they need it.
So, Johanne, thank you so much for joining us today on City Watch for our special World AIDS Day program. Can you end by just saying those two websites for our listeners one more time?
Absolutely. So I'll say thank you to both of you for the opportunity, and to anyone who's interested in getting more information as it relates to ending the epidemic overall. The website is ETE-Dashboard-NY.org. And for information on ending the epidemic, as well as the events that are being hosted by New York State next week on December 4th and 5th, please go to www.health.ny.gov and search for Ending the Epidemic.
Johanne, thank you so much for joining Edwina and me today on WBAI.
Thank you so much.
So we have our third and final guest in just a moment. And, full disclosure, I've come to know him. His name is Eugene Eppes. He works with Alliance for Positive Change, and I'm going to let him talk a little about his work and his role there. but he is a really enthusiastic champion when it comes to being on the front lines of educating people and helping people with HIV, AIDS, understand what they're, how to find help, how to access resources. And, I'm actually telling his story, so I'm going to stop myself and just say a little about him. He is what is known as a community linkage specialist at Alliance, and he's a brave example of positive change. Eugene, welcome to our show today.
Hey, good morning, everyone. How are you?
Good morning. So, Eugene, first, because I started to tell your whole job description, I'm going to leave it to you. Can you please tell our listeners a little about what you do for Alliance for Positive Change and what Alliance for Positive Change is?
Okay, so the Alliance for Positive Change help New Yorkers affected by HIV or other chronic illnesses to make lasting and positive changes towards health and housing and recovery and self-sufficiency. And each year, the Alliance help New Yorkers get tested for HIV, overcome addictions, access medical care to get their health back on track, escape homelessness, and rejoin the world of work, such as I did, and replace isolation with community and lead healthier, more lives sufficiently for New Yorkers in our community.
So tell our listeners a little about your story. What brought you to Alliance? What was your life like at that point, and about your evolution since joining becoming part of the Alliance.
Vividly, I have served some extensive prison time, and I was released in 2014, and I returned from the Hamptons to my mom's couch. And I just wanted to get my life back on track and give myself the opportunity to live on the right side of the law. So I was at Housing Works at the time, receiving medical care at Housing Works. And my case manager told me about this housing that the Alliance had that was opening up at Pelham Grand. And I was the second person that moved in that building through the Alliance. And it was July 2014. And I went in for an interview to do an intake, and the guy sat with me and just listened to my story. And he told me about this PrEP program. That's the peer recovery education program. And it was an 8-week program. And at the time I was working at City College. So I had to decide what I was going to do. I needed the money. I just came home. I had to start from scratch. I had nothing but 2 pair of pants, 2 underwear, 2 shirts, 2 pair of sneakers. And I had to make something happen for myself. It was either that or be dead or back in jail, and I didn't want neither of the two. So I quit my job at City College, and I gave myself the opportunity. I went through their 8-week training. I did another 6-week training with them for health coach. And then I was facilitating. I facilitated for a while. I was on a couple of reentry grants. And then I got involved with the Positive Life Workshop, which is a self-management workshop for people who have HIV and AIDS. And I just took off from there. I had a lot of self-disclosure issues. I was paranoid about everybody knowing my diagnosis. But at that point, it was like, for me, I just got the epiphany of, like, what does it matter if somebody know that you're positive or not? I'm living healthier than I ever was before, running the streets and stuff. And I just heard something at one of our group meetings that told me it's a no-holds-barred. And that's why I'm on the front line at the Alliance.
Well, Eugene, this is Edwina. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing your poignant and very powerful story. I'm sure that today, World AIDS Day, is a time of reflection for you, and sort of looking back and pondering these things. The work you're doing sounds fascinating. I'm sure very difficult, however, going into communities to educate others about HIV prevention and treatment. what are some of the most common misperceptions that you encounter in your work?
The misconceptions that I encounter is most of the individuals that I service look at me and think that, that I'm holier than thou, and I'm kind of an all right looking guy, and they look at me like HIV has a face. And until I open my mouth and tell them that I'm actually HIV positive, no one will ever guess it. And I guess they think that individuals are looking at them, that they can't live their life and be who they are because people are going to judge them for what they have and what they look like. So for me, I show them that HIV has no face.
I'm looking back at a year ago, Eugene, when I first had met you, and really just seeing how far you have come in, being very open and comfortable and being able to talk with people so openly and sharing your story. Have there still been challenges in the last year? What has this experience been like? Or do you feel much freer because of being very open?
I'm freer, but now I'm facing a challenge that that really is like it's not an experience for me. I tell most of my clients, and I shared the quote yesterday at the Alliance, and I stand by this, and it's really touching, that physical evidence don't have an opinion, nor feeling, nor emotion. Physical evidence speaks loud and clear. I am physical evidence. So with that being said, is like, I am evidence. People could go and speculate that they might die, that medication might make them sick, but they never tried it, and they're not willing to try it because they know this to be true. But when I come across individuals like that, they look at me and they want to see the evidence, and I am the evidence.
That's really very powerful. So one of the misconceptions that you're hearing is that the medicine will make people sick?
Will make people sick and overweight, and they're going to get buffalo humps, or their stomach might get big, and some of those things may be true, but it's like this: you put in what you get out. So if I'm taking my medication on time, I know that I might have to go to the gym, because there's no miracle pill that people want to be slim. Some people want to be big. Some people and everybody want a quick fix. You have to work towards whatever you want in life. And some people don't want to work for it. And another thing that I'm encountering that I've never experienced is the crystal meth in our community now. That's another whole fight that nobody wants to talk about. And it's affecting our community. We're speaking about ending an epidemic, but however, we could be virally suppressed. We could have a CD4 count of 1,100. But what we're not talking about is the rise of STDs and STIs in our community, because people are on PrEP. They're not transmitting HIV, true, but they transmitting other diseases. So, and with that drug in the community, people don't care what they contract.
So part of the work that you're doing then is also trying to address these other issues that you're seeing?
Yes.
So Eugene,
and that goes back to our alliance, because we address some of those issues, overcoming, as I mentioned, overcoming drug addiction. That's something that has to be looked at, along with protecting yourself and having a good rival load and having a good CD4 count. We have to look at the underlying issues that these people are, or me, myself, are turning to other things. Everybody turns to something else. Like with me, when I found out that I was diagnosed, I was suicidal. And I couldn't tell that to anybody in our community, because guess what? Mental health is frowned upon. So when you come to the Alliance, we could address mental health issues. I never thought I had a mental health issue, but I've been through some traumatizing things in my life. And I have to address those issues if I say I don't want to revert back to the person that I am. And this is what the community fail to realize. And my job is to say that to them. Nobody's saying that to them. Everybody's afraid to say something. Everybody's so sensitive these days, nobody can take anything said to them. That's actual fact. They rather have people lie to them.
So, Eugene, we have asked our previous two guests today about the significance of World AIDS Day. So I want to pose the same question to you and ask, what message do you want to get across to our listeners about the significance of this day?
This day is significant because we're standing on the shoulders for those who came before us. And if I thank God for this day, because we are taking one pill opposed to 18 and 20 4 times a day. I would rather this day than that day any day. But I do have love and respect for the people that came before me, and I'm keeping their vision alive by being on the forefront of this fight. And I just encourage you guys to be on the forefront for this fight.
Eugene, I have been at several of the Alliance for Positive Change's peer graduation ceremonies. And, I believe I think I was at the one where you had graduated as well. Were you class 49 or 50? 49?
I was 43.
43? Oh, wow.
Yeah,
but you
I was
spoke.
the keynote.
So when was that?
Yeah, I was the keynote speaker for, I believe, 50 or 49.
So what I'm leading into is when when you attend this ceremony, you see the warmth and community, in the room. Who are the people? Who are these peers? And what are they doing? We've only got about a minute left, but I really want you to talk about who the peers are, because you're not doing this alone. There's, been hundreds, I believe it's probably over 1,000 who've gone through these graduation ceremonies. Who are they? Who are they? Tell us.
So who are the peers? I was a peer. I am consider myself still to be a peer because I relate to people like friends and family members. So I came to the Alliance. I graduated from Cycle 43 of the peer program. And the peer program is people who have lived experience that could reach people going through the same things that you're going through. And we educate other people from our experiences. That's who peers are. Peers could reach people that others who haven't experienced what we experience can't.
So Jeff just...
It's like...
Oh, sorry.
If you visualize... that's all right. If you visualize this, a person who has no hair trying to tell somebody with hair how to manage their hair.
Jeff just pulled up your website. We are positive change. I love that tagline.
Yeah, we are. We are positive change.
So, Eugene, we've got about only a few moments left. We want to thank you for being on the show. The website, Edwina, did you get that down, or you want to say it?
Yes, it's alliance.nyc. Is that right, Eugene?
Yes, it's www.alliance.nyc. And if you want to reach out to me to talk to me and get some services at the Alliance, you can email me, eugene@alliance.nyc. And you could come in and schedule an appointment. And I should say that our line should be around the corner Monday morning.
So Eugene, in our very last minute, what do you want your legacy to be?
I want my legacy to be that I have people behind me saving the day, like sort of superhero stuff. That's what I want my legacy to be, that they could see the before and after.
Oh, that's a beautiful legacy. Eugene, thank you so much for joining us on City Watch today. Have a great day of remembrance. And I wish you much luck in this incredible work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. Oh, by the way, ETE Summit. I'm speaking at the ETE Summit, 4th and the 5th in Albany.
Oh, wonderful. We just had Johanne Morne talking about that. So hopefully some of our listeners will make their way.
Yeah, we're going to be in the building. And shout out to Sharon Duke.
All right, you have a
Sharon's the head of the organization, but we've got to wrap up. Eugene,
okay.
thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Jeff.
So with that, another edition of City Watch is coming to a close. We want to thank our guests once again, City Council Member Danny Dromm, Johanne Morne, Director of the New York State Health Department's AIDS Institute, and Eugene Eppes, a Community Linkage Specialist, Alliance for Positive Change. Thanks to our engineer, Sean Rhodes, for a wonderful performance on the boards, and thanks especially to all of you, our listeners, for supporting this show. We can't do any of this without your support. If you missed any or a part of the show or just want to listen in again, the MP3 download is available at www.wbai.org. Click on Archives and then City Watch. The show will be up and ready to listen to online in about 10 minutes, and will stay up for 90 days. And we wish you a good World AIDS Day.